that market perspective as the night goes on. Let's turn now to another major issue that dominated the 2016 campaign. That is taxes. Joining us from Washington is a man closely associated with tax policy, Grover Norquist. He's founder and president of Americans for Tax Reform, a nonpartisan taxpayer advocacy group. And with us from Manchester, New Hampshire, is former Senator Judd Gregg. He's also co-chair of the campaign Fix the Debt. Grover Norquist, let me start with you here. Your stance on tax is well known here. Are you happy with the degree to which taxes have been discussed here on the campaign?
No, I think it's rather odd, given that the two candidates have very different views. Donald Trump has called for taking the corporate rate, the American corporate rate, highest in the world, from 35% down to 15%, which would make us very competitive with the rest of the world. Go to full expensing, extremely important. Go to territoriality, allow American companies to bring their money back. And Hillary wants a $1.3 trillion tax increase. She cuts tax rates for nobody, no company, no individual. And she's even called for massive tax increases on low-income people, even though she said she wouldn't. Everything from soda pop to guns to wages. She endorsed a wage tax on anybody who earns less than $120,000 a year that she borrowed from her competitor, the Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont. So they've gone in completely different directions on taxes, very interesting, and it's gotten little attention because the personality stuff on both sides has dominated cable TV.
Let's look at this, though, and the one thing that everyone is going to be talking about, and I want to put this to both of you, is if either of them gets in tonight, we'll have a president tonight. One thing everyone's looking at is the signature piece that they're going to look for is comprehensive tax reform on both a corporate, an individual, and an international basis. Grover, starting with you, do you think either president can do what has been impossible, which is to actually get that type of reform through?
Well, if Trump is elected with a Republican House and Senate, his plan and Paul Ryan's plan and Senator Hatch's plan are very similar. In an afternoon, you could hammer those together and everybody would be very happy. That's a dramatic tax reform, including international competition, immediately. Hillary wants to increase taxes $1.3 trillion. There's no room for reform. She hasn't called for any reductions. She says she has a secret plan on corporate tax reform, but since she wants higher taxes, the Republican House or Senate would never give her that, so she doesn't have a plan. Trump's plan would actually work.
All right.
Would pass.
Senator Judd Gregg in New Hampshire, waiting patiently there. I'll ask you to respond to that, the likelihood here that we could see some sort of comprehensive tax reform here in the new term.
I think it's fairly unlikely, especially if Hillary wins. I think that Grover Norquist is right. Her proposals aren't tax reform. They're massive tax increases. If Trump wins, you cannot do major tax reform unless you do it in a bipartisan manner. That was proved by Ronald Reagan when he did the Reagan-Rostenkowski tax reform, which was really the last substantive and thoughtful tax reform we've had as a nation. Now, there are some people who want to do that on the Democratic side of the aisle. Ron Wyden is one of them. He's the ranking member on the Finance Committee. And if you can put those folks in a room with thoughtful Republicans like Paul Ryan, maybe you can put together a package. But it's going to be a challenge because if it isn't bipartisan, it isn't going to pass and it isn't going to be seen as fair.
Senator Gregg, when we talk about this, we talk about infrastructure. And for so long in Washington, we talk about the dream of infrastructure spending. It's always been tied to tax reform. That's how we're going to pay for it. Is there any possibility, not maybe of a grand bargain, but a smaller bargain, maybe just targeting international of that repatriation of so many of the earnings held offshore and bringing them back for perhaps, let's say, an 8 to 14%, a tax holiday, so to speak? Do you see even that component possibility of getting through?
That's a distinct possibility. We did it in the middle of the 2010 decade. Senator Ensign at that time from Nevada offered a bill, and it passed where it was a 5% tax on repatriated funds. It makes a lot of sense. It'd be much smarter to go to a territorial system, as Grover Norquist mentioned, but that means you've got to have major tax reform to accomplish that. So a one-time or a two-year repatriation system where you paid a tax rate of somewhere between 5 and 10%, and then use the revenues from that to fund your infrastructure expansion, which both sides seem to want right now, makes a lot of sense. I think it's a place where bipartisanship could be reached, and it would be a natural place to start out in a positive way if you were president to try to work something that could get done.
Grover Norquist, last question to you here. We had that announcement from the European Commission about Apple's tax bill, the controversy surrounding that, the Treasury Secretary weighing in, a lot of contentiousness there. Do you think that was a watershed moment? Has that changed the appetite among politicians, among Americans here for some kind of corporate tax reform?
Look, we need to take our rate down. It's 35. It's out of line. The European average is 25. Trump's talked about 15. The Republicans in the House have 20 as their goal. Hillary likes 35, evidently. If you have a united Republican government, they can unilaterally, without a single Democrat vote, pass 10 years of tax reform. And then, as we did more recently, make most of that permanent 10 years from now. Unfortunately, given the partisan nature and the Democrats' desire to raise taxes rather than reform them, it will have to be a Republican-only plan if the Republicans win. And it can. It'll be good for 10 years, and then we'll have to re-up it.
All right, Grover Norquist, thank you very much.
I would just want to add to that. I want to add to that. Excuse me. That's a singularly absurd position. You can't accomplish major tax in Washington, even if you control both houses and the presidency, because it takes 60 votes in the Senate. No, you're going to have to do a bipartisan package here. You're going to have to go across the aisle. And one of the reasons bipartisan tax reform has not worked is because Grover Norquist's group has opposed it, such as it did when we had major tax reform under the Simpson-Bowles bill. And so I don't think Grover is right on that. I said he was right on some other things, but on this point, he's very wrong.
Grover, I'll let you respond quickly, then we've got to move on. Go ahead.
Okay. You can Google it. Under reconciliation, with 51 senators, a Republican majority in the House, and a president, you can sign a tax bill that's good for 10 years.
No, you can't, Grover.
At the end
you
of
cannot
10
use
years,
reconciliation to cut taxes unless you offset it with income, as you know, because reconciliation requires that it be revenue neutral. So that's not accomplishable, Grover. You should know that from having worked in the Congress.
You ought to tell that to the Bush people in 2001 and 2003.
I actually passed the last reconciliation bill,
Grover Norquist,
and I understand that because I was chairman of the Budget Committee.
From Washington, D.C., Senator Judd Gregg joining us from New Hampshire tonight, again, as we see a strong market reaction to the